Hello, this is Joseph Holbrook, your professor for uh, Introduction to Latin American and Caribbean Studies. And today we're going to talk about religion in Latin America. Religion in Latin America. This is week 11 of the full semester. I don't recall which week it is of the term B. So you may have recognized that film or that music that was playing as Gabriel's oboe from the film The Mission, one of my favorite films about Jesuits working to protect Guarani Indians in Paraguay in 1757, more or less. That's another topic for another day. But I want to begin with religion in Latin America. There are more Catholics in Latin America than there are in any other part of the world. So Latin America is the largest Catholic continent in the world, and Brazil contains a large number of those Catholics. It has the largest national church with more than 140 million believers and 350 bishops. At the same time, there are more Pentecostals in Latin America than any other continent, and half of them are in Brazil. So as you can see, Latin America is a very religious region, and it includes both Catholics and Protestants, and as we'll see, spiritists of 3 or 4 different kinds. This material, for the most part, is taken from Peter Winn's Americas, Chapter 10, and also from a couple articles by Daniel Levine from 1988 and 2009. In 1991, John Paul II visited Brazil for the second time, which was an indication of how important Brazil is to the Catholic Church, and that was also the 10th visit over a 10-year period after Vatican II. From 1962 and 1965 was Vatican II, and by 1991 John Paul II had visited Latin America 10 times. Big changes were going on in Latin America. One of the biggest was liberation theology. Liberation theology is a term that was coined, I suppose, primarily by Gustavo Gutierrez, but it emerged in several different places around 1970. This is a new kind of theology that was being done in Latin America from the point of view of the poor, as opposed to Europe, where there were very different existential concerns. Part of the move of liberation theology in Latin America included what were known as SEBs, Christian-based communities, or Comunidades Eclesiales de Base, SEBs. These were small communities of 30 to 50 people spread around Latin America that involved the laity in a greater measure in the work of ministry of the church, and also involved them in literacy campaigns and social movements and so on. There were 800, according to the author of the chapter in Winn's Americas, there were 800 church martyrs during this period of the Cold War, the 1960s and 70s and the 1980s. This was, as I mentioned, this was coterminal with the Cold War, with several revolutions beginning in 1959 with Cuba and later in 1979 in Nicaragua. There was also a great deal of repression in Argentina, Brazil, Chile, by military dictatorships. One of the leading liberation theologians was from Brazil, Leonardo Boff, who popularized the phrase Jesus as the liberator of the poor and the idea of reinventing the church. I should probably turn that sound off, but I'm not sure how. During this, to give a little historical context, during this time period, there was a number of things happening on the world stage, especially in Latin America. In 1959, there was the revolution in Cuba. In 1969, the Latin American bishops in an organization called CELAM met in Medellin, Colombia, and began to talk about a preferential option for the poor. Also, in 1968, Paulo Freire in Brazil published his book Pedagogy of the Oppressed, which had a focus on grassroots consciousness raising for poor rural people, peasants. They combined consciousness raising and teaching critical thinking with literacy training. 1969, Dependency and Development in America was released in Spanish in Chile by Enrique Cardozo, a future president of Brazil, and Ernesto Faleto. Also, in 1971, The Theology of Liberation was published by Gustavo Gutierrez of Peru. It wasn't the only book with this title. Another one was called there was another one that had a very similar title that was published in Brazil. So here are those three books that they appeared one almost in rapid fire, 68, 69, and 71. Pedagogy of the Oppressed, Dependency and Development, and A Theology of Liberation. All of these brought into question the modernism and the developmental model of change, and pointed to the need for something fairly revolutionary to speak to the problems of inequality and poverty in Latin America. And remember, this was in the right after the revolution in Cuba, which in the beginning was not perceived as necessarily a Soviet socialist revolution, and brought some hope for the poor in Latin America that perhaps there might be a way out of their poverty. 1959 through the early 70s. Also, there was the Cold War going on during this time. This was the Cold War began in 1948 and continued until 1989, but the peak of the Cold War was probably 1963 with the Cuban Missile Crisis, the 13 days in October. Then in the 1960s, there was also a series of military dictatorships, and also continuing into the 1970s. 1964 was the Brazilian military coup, which overthrew elected democracy in Brazil. Then in 1965, Che Guevara was killed in Bolivia trying to export the Cuban Revolution to South America. 1973, there was a Chilean military coup, which overthrew the first elected socialist president in Latin America. Then in Uruguay, the same thing happened. In 1976, there was an Argentinian military coup. In 1979, Somoza was driven out of Nicaragua, and there was the Nicaraguan Revolution. Then in 1980, in next door El Salvador, Archbishop Romero was assassinated while ministering the Eucharist. There's a great movie with Raul Julia about his life that I highly recommend called Romero. You can find it for free on YouTube. In the same year, 1980, 4 American nuns that were working as missionaries in El Salvador were stopped along the side of a road in a rural area, raped and killed by the El Salvadoran military. Also in the 1980s, with the election of Ronald Reagan, money began to be funneled to the Contras in Nicaragua. The Contras were contra. They were against the revolution, or they were counter-revolutionaries. And a civil war began in Nicaragua and in neighboring El Salvador, partially or fully funded by the United States. 1989, 6 Jesuit priests were assassinated by a death squad that was trained by the El Salvadoran military. Their 2 housekeepers were also killed in the same incident. Very brutal period of time. This is a picture of Archbishop Romero after he was shot while leading the Eucharist. 1964 in Brazil, there was a military coup. There was also some very powerful progressive Christian movements going on in Brazil among the Catholic university students. The military dictatorship in Brazil combined economic growth with political repression. One of the progressive heroes of the Catholic Church of this era was Dom Helder Câmara, the Bishop of Recife. He emerged as a leading defender of human rights and an advocate of social justice. He was also the leader of the Brazilian Council of Bishops. Bishop Adriano Hipólito was kidnapped and beaten. You see a similar scene if you watch the movie Romero, where Archbishop Oscar Romero was put in prison and roughed up and mistreated. This happened all over Latin America during this time, and many bishops and priests and friars became involved in the struggle for human rights and were abused and in some cases kidnapped and killed or disappeared. The SEBs, the Comunidades Eclesiales de Base, after 1968, 80,000 SEBs were estimated to be formed in Brazil, teaching critical thinking skills and using scripture and developing leadership skills, literacy. That was just in Brazil, 80,000. Some people saw this as a sort of Protestant Reformation within the Catholic Church in the sense that they were developing lay-led congregations within their parishes and dioceses. Cardinal Arns, Paul Evaristo Arns, the Archbishop of São Paulo, was a strong progressive bishop. He strongly supported the development of grassroots SEBs. He became a critic of the unequal development of the economy of Brazil. He supported union meetings and social movements to restore democracy. I just want to add that I was in Brazil in 2005 to study Portuguese in the Copacabana, and every morning when I walked to the language school, I was stepping over bodies of people sleeping on the streets, sleeping on the sidewalk. So the unequal development, even though Brazil is considered to be a emerging regional power, the unequal development meant a great degree of homelessness and poverty. 1971, Arns and a priest were roughed up by the military authorities. In Argentina, there was a different situation. Only 4 out of 80 bishops defended the causes of human rights. Some of the bishops were even complicit in terrible human rights abuses by the Argentine military. And John Paul II had been a priest in Poland where he had seen suffering under the authoritarianism of a Marxist regime. And so he was extra concerned about some of the Marxist leanings of liberation theology, the use of Marxist methods of analysis. And he reacted by appointing a conservative to head up the Latin American Bishops' Council, Salem. The Archbishop was Colombian Alfonso Lopez Trujillo, who began to work actively to try to undermine the liberation theology among the bishops. Here's a picture of, on the far right, Lula da Silva. He was a union leader of the Workers' Party. Later, he became president of Brazil. On the far left is Leonardo Boff, one of the preeminent theologians of liberation in Latin America. He has since left the priesthood after being forbidden to speak by the papacy. In the middle is Cardinal Paul Evaristo Arns, the Archbishop of São Paulo. The Sandinista Revolution took place in 1979. It was a multi-class, multi-party mass uprising against a corrupt dictator named Anastasio Somoza. He was driven out. The majority of Catholic priests and many Protestant ministers supported the Sandinista Revolution. Several priests after the revolution were named to prominent cabinet positions in the new Sandinista government. One of them was Ernesto Cardenal, who is a poet, and he's written several interesting books. Before the revolution, he led several sebs, or ecclesial-based communities, on an island in the middle of Lake Nicaragua. When John Paul II visited Nicaragua in 1983, he rebuked Ernesto Cardenal for occupying a position in the government as Minister of Culture. And there's a picture of Pope John II shaking his finger at Ernesto Cardenal when he knelt down to kiss the Pope's ring. So, as you can imagine, these are not easy years for some of the people, some of the priests and leaders of the Catholic Church in Latin America. The liberation theology is part of the Latin American response to the changes in Catholicism since Vatican II. There are several complexities at issue in liberation theology. The chapter in the book mentions three of them. The interpretation of the Christian faith is developed out of the suffering and the hope of the poor. And so liberation theologians take as their starting place the experience of the poor to interpret Scripture. They critique society and the ideologies that sustain society. They also critique the activity of the church and the Christians from the angle of the poor. And so at the heart of liberation theology, there is a critique of the status quo. Several related themes about liberation theology include four basic issues: concern with history and historical change, which is not surprising because it's influenced by Marxism, and Marxism is called historical dialectical materialism, and it emphasizes change over historical time. There's a second concern is return to biblical sources with a reinterpretation of many biblical stories and principles. Stress on the poor is the third one, and a related emphasis on doing theology in a way that enhances the value of everyday experience and insight of average people. A word for this in Marxism as well as liberation theology is praxis, the idea of praxis. Karl Marx is famously to have said that the point of history and philosophy is not to study it, but to change it. And also, liberation theology, at least in the beginning, had close and complex relations with Marxism. After some of the criticisms of the Pope, some of the liberation theologians tried to distance themselves from Marxism and draw more of their critique directly from the scriptures. SEBs are ecclesial-based communities, comunidades eclesiales de base. So this gives the idea that they're grassroots, de base, base or foundational. They're ecclesial, which means they're tied to the church. They're not independent. They're not bringing division. They are church-based, and they're communities. In this sense, they're smaller, and they give room for face-to-face relationships and mutual engagement. Small and homogeneous. Most SEBs are like small groups of 10 to 30 people, ordinarily homogeneous in social composition, usually composed of poor people. They gather regularly once a week, every week or two, to read and comment on the Bible, to discuss common concerns, and occasionally to act together towards some concrete end. During this same time period, particularly in about the mid-1970s, I was involved in an intentional community movement up in New England, otherwise known as communes. And I actually helped start a couple communes and help lead them fairly unsuccessfully. I was a hippie at the time. But the interesting thing was that among Quakers, among a number of Mennonite groups, religious groups, hippies, there was a strong emphasis on small communities, small groups, people living in intentional community. Also, within evangelical churches, there was an emphasis on cell groups and cell churches, and cell-based churches, house churches. All of this emerged about the same time simultaneously in a number of different parts of the world. In South Korea, the largest church in the world was a cell-based church, Paul Young-gi Cho. That's a topic I don't know that anyone has studied, why in the 1970s and so many diverse situations in diverse parts of the world, these small intentional communities would develop, but perhaps one I'd like to pursue one day. Liberation theology and the SEBs were linked historically, and it is fair to say that they are related as theory is to practice. In the 1970s, began a major growth spurt of the SEBs. Of course, in some places like Brazil, that there was no room. There was a military dictatorship, so the only space, public space, where people could operate freely, free of military control, was the SEBs themselves, and so that could explain part of the reason for their growth, and then their later decline after Brazil returned to a period of democracy in 1985. The ordinary experience of SEBs reinforces ideas of egalitarianism and collective action. Protestantism is also important in Latin America. Throughout the 19th century, there were growing Protestant missions and Protestant educational institutions in Latin America, but in the 20th century, there began to be an explosion of one particular group of Protestants called Pentecostals. There are now more Protestant preachers than there are Catholic priests in Brazil, for example. Born-again Brazilians are estimated to be as many as 30 million in Brazil. Half of Latin America's Protestants live in Brazil. So Brazil is a unique country when it comes to religion. Largest Catholic country, largest Pentecostal country. Pentecostalism has its roots in Methodist theology and Baptist recipe for salvation. Pentecostalism emphasizes conversion through a direct experience of the Holy Spirit. In religious studies, we call this a numinous experience or an ecstatic experience. In the 1930s, Pentecostals represented only 1 in 10 Brazilian Protestants. By 1964, they were 7 out of 8. All Pentecostals are Protestants, but not all Protestants are Pentecostals. I go to a Lutheran church. It is not considered to be Pentecostal. However, all Pentecostals are Protestants. There is one exception which we won't really have time to talk about, which is the Catholic Charismatic Renewal, which numbers 4 million in Brazil. These are Catholic Pentecostals, which just contradicted my point that all Pentecostals are Protestants. But that's all classical Pentecostals. There are Catholics who have a Pentecostal-like experience. And here's a picture of Eder Macedo, the bishop of the IURD, the Igreja Universal do Reino de Deus in Rio de Janeiro, praying for the sick. One of the things that Pentecostals have in common is that they believe in divine healing, prayer for the sick, supernatural miracles, speaking in tongues, prophecy, which is very congenial with some aspects of Latin American and Caribbean culture. It approaches the idea of spiritism and a direct experience of the spiritual from a slightly different angle. So now talking about Brazilian spiritism, this is the third great family, religious family in Brazil. Brazilian spiritism began in France, actually, in 1857, with the Book of Spirits, transmitted from a spirit called Allan Kardec to a medium, and this was a form of spiritism called Kardecism. In Europe, it was more intellectual, but in Brazil, it took root and grew and became much more experience-oriented, much more mystical. By 1997, there were 17 million spiritists in Brazil. Kardecism was being transformed into a mystical religion of the educated middle classes. Afro-Brazilians and Amerindian deities were recognized as real, but were rejected as ignorant spirits which lack culture. In Brazil, there's also a couple of Afro-diasporan religions, similar to Santeria in Miami or Cuba or Voodoo. These are Candomblé and Macumba. Afro-Brazilian religions composed mostly of black lower-class devotees. Umbanda is a very interesting case because Umbanda borrowed from Candomblé, but it also borrowed from Kardechism. And it came into existence as a new religion in the 20th century, centered on the Brazilian spirits rejected by Kardechism. So it's basically a Kardechism that adopted elements of Candomblé. It was founded in Rio de Janeiro in the 1920s. It has spirit possession. It practices spirit possession with Indian and African spirits, which reflect myths of the Brazil's past as visualized in popular culture. Brazilian Candomblé, like Haitian Voodoo, is a religion of African villages, says the author of this chapter. Umbanda, on the other hand, is a translation of African beliefs in a way that Brazilian city dwellers can understand. White, middle-class, Brazilian, urban, upwardly mobile. It's adapted for them. Some consider Umbanda a simplification of Candomblé. It's one pai meaning father, in the Umbanda tradition, described it as a lesser truth for a broader public, sort of a watered-down form of Candomblé, with a liberal dash of Kardechism thrown in. Umbanda is identified to Brazilian nationalism. So Umbanda is concrete and it's problem solving, and it's also very Brazilian. This is a spirit possession in an Umbanda service. So Umbanda is Brazil, whereas Candomblé is Africa. Umbanda centers in pure or white Umbanda throughout Brazil cater to educated middle-class people. Umbanda ceremony begins oftentimes with the invocation of Jesus. This allows a lot of Umbanda practitioners to also maintain their participation in Catholicism. Umbanda's eclecticism allows it to absorb new influences from Theosophy, Rosicrucianism, Kardechism, Candomblé, and popular Catholicism. Umbanda is like Brazil. It takes in everything, mixes them together, and makes them into something all its own. I mentioned earlier that Umbanda's eclecticism allows it to absorb new influences, and I mentioned that many Catholics practice Umbanda, and many Umbanda practitioners are Catholic, but this is very different when it comes to Pentecostalism. A lot of the recent emphasis of what's called neo-Pentecostals is it's very black and white, and it's very much attacking Umbanda and Candomblé, and they emphasize exorcism of demonic spirits that have been ingested or imbibed by Brazilian practitioners by participating in Umbanda or Candomblé. I attended a service of the Igreja Universal do Reino de Deus when I was in Rio de Janeiro, and at one point, this is a huge football stadium-like building full of people, and at one point there were 10 or 15 people stumbling around at the front of the chapel or the cathedral, manifesting demonic possession that they had picked up by participating in Candomblé or Umbanda, and the pastors were in the process of performing exorcisms over them. So, whereas a Catholic can be practice Umbanda, and there's Umbanda is eclectic enough to admit other influences, it cannot do that with Pentecostalism or even helicalism, because they're very much black and white. They very much see each other as competitors and at odds for dominance in Latin America. So that's religion in Latin America. Catholicism, Protestantism, and Spiritism. And we shall continue again with you next week. Thank you for your time and attention.